beautiful afternoon to all. Maúpay nga kulóp haatan niyo tanan. Once again, this is Bátì UP Tacloban, and today we are thrilled to launch the program Mana-bánà, which features conversations about ideas and speculations on topics in various academic disciplines. At the same time, we are launching the Kaagi, Kabilin, Kultura, History, Heritage, Culture conversation series. And our launching episode for this is indeed special, as we are joined by the prominent historian of Eastern Visayas, Dr. Rolando Borrinaga. Sir Rolly, open yung kulupay mo.
Open yung kulupay mo,
It's almost like you need no introduction, but can you tell us a bit more about your career in the academe, particularly your career as a historian?
Well, actually, I started out as a health science person, and then while in the academe, I went into community journalism, and finally went into local history, and I have published several books about local history of the late Samar region.
And you're currently a faculty member of UP Manila, right?
I am a faculty member of the School of Health Sciences at UP Manila, with the main campus in Palolid.
This afternoon, we're actually going to zero in on significant events which we are commemorating in the Philippines this year, and that's the 500th year anniversary of the first encounter between Spain and what would later be named the Philippines. So we would like to know, Dr. Borrinaga, can you tell us about your engagement in the Quincentennial Commemorations in the Philippines?
Well, related to the Quincentennial Commemoration, I had actually written revisionist papers about the Limasawa Easter Sunday Mass, and also Limasawa Easter Sunday Mass is contested by Butuan. While Homonhon, I also wrote a paper which I presented in a conference, which actually tried to clean up the story because it has been garbled by other documents, including a hoax that can be traced to Jose Marco, the famous hoax artist in Philippine history.
I see the same person who also is associated with the Code of
Kalanchao, and another episode involving Lapu-Lapu and supposedly a female person in Cebu.
Right. So it's important to correct these errors.
It's important to correct those errors, and insofar as the Limasawa event is concerned, I actually added new documents, primary documents that would support an early theory I had submitted and published in 2008 that the first Easter Sunday Mass was held in Western Limasawa and not in Southeastern Limasawa, Barangay Magallanes, as still observed through the past century. So I was able to provide evidence and then presented that to the Mujeres panel, which tried to settle the issue between Butuan and Limasawa, and actually the Mujeres panel upheld my findings, and in fact endorsed my recommendation of adopting Western Limasawa as the site of the first Easter Sunday Mass in 1521. Because I was able to locate the approximate place where the Mass may have been celebrated, and this is the area of the church, Catholic Church in Barangay Triana, and also I was able to identify the approximate hilltop where the cross was planted in 1521.
And your method involved not only close reading of chronicles, right? But did you actually go to the place also
I
and interview
have
people?
been to Limasawa a number of times
Uh,
as for the cultural mapping activity. And so I had both gone to the place, involved myself in gathering data for the cultural mapping, and had also read primary documents available.
so the first mass in Limasawa, it happened on the 31st of March. Is that right?
March 31, 1521.
1521, and that's of course part of the Quincentennial Commemorations.
It's part of the Quincentennial Commemoration, but the government is basically keeping a hands off on the church-related activities.
Right. Because
So the church-related activities would be spearheaded by the Catholic Church. In this case, in Southern Leyte, it's by the Diocese of Maasin, and in Eastern Samar by the Diocese of Borongan.
So these church-related commemorations are separate from the National Quincentennial Commemorations Committee, or
Well, some are incidentally included. So for instance, there will be 34 markers, national quincentennial markers, that will be unveiled during the year from across the parts of the Philippines that have been visited or mentioned by in the Pigafetta account. At least Limasawa and the Eastern San Dimas there would have a national quincentennial committee marker, but the government is taking a hands off of the Quincentennial commemoration of that event.
So the first mass happened on March 31, 1521, but today, March 16, we are commemorating, of course, something that happened earlier. So I'd like to ask you, why is March 16 significant in Philippine history?
Well, we know, of course, March in Philippines was discovered by Magellan. But anyway, there had been a big debate. Was the Philippines discovered by Magellan? And so Agoncillo, the historian, said it's not rediscovered. But until recently, there had been a lot of confusion because at least it's now agreed that March 16 was the day of the sighting of the future Philippines. And then they landed somewhere in March 16, 1521. They anchored off Suluan. On March 17, they landed on Homonhon Island. Now this is a big issue because for years now, Eastern Samar celebrated both what they call the discovery of the Philippines and the landing in Homonhon on March 16, every March 16, ignoring the fact that Pigafetta mentioned that the landing in Homonhon was March 17. And also it had been clarified just recently because the Father Nil Penitencia of the Diocese of Borongan, Chancellor, and I basically complained to the National Historical Commission of the Philippines because in the marker for draft marker for Samar, they actually said that March 16 was the feast day of San Lazaro, after which our islands, the islands of the region,
in Eastern Visayas
of San Lazaro. So they said that it was named March 16 is San Lazaro Day, and so it was disputed. I disputed that, and then Father Penitencia also sent a position paper, and then finally we were able to actually establish that it was March 17 March 17 was the
Day of the land.
San Lazaro Sunday, the feast day of San Lazaro.
Right.
And so the naming of our island sa San Lazaro was made on March 17, related to the landing on Homonhon. And March 17 will be commemorated as an event, landing in Homonhon for the first time this year.
Because in
In fact,
previous
one
years,
year.
it has been
It's
on March 16.
March 16. So
Yeah, after 500 years though. So there's still a lot of aspects of our history that are yet to be corroborated, no?
And at least now, what is given highlight now is March 18, the humanity aspect, the meeting between the natives of Suluan and the Magellan expedition. So it's now part of the theme of the Quincentennial, humanity and victory. Humanity in Homonhon, victory in Mactan.
So, well, today, March 16, you're saying that, well, it is still significant in the sense that it was the first sighting
First sighting
of
Asia by westward travelers.
Right. Let's
In
try to imagine the geography. So Magellan's crew, their fleet, was coming from the Pacific,
the Strait
right?
of Magellan,
So
Southern Pacific.
Southern Pacific, and then they were approaching.
Then they for 3 months, 90 days, they did not see any land. It was all ocean.
While traveling across the Pacific Ocean, right?
And it was very calm. No storms. And finally, they arrived in what Ladrones, what is now Guam. And then they had a bad experience there. Pinagnakawan sila.
Pinagnakawan. That's why it's called Ladrones.
They retaliated by massacring some locals. And so they could not actually get much food there. And so they proceeded to here, and they cited what's now the Philippines.
Ladrones means thieves, right? In Spanish.
So they called it Isla de Ladrones.
So this crew actually, they were coming to what would be named the Philippines after having a very horrible experience, right? I recall there was starvation, there was disease.
Many of them died of scurvy. So they were very tired, they were very sick, and they wanted some rest and hungry. They were also very hungry.
So that moment of arriving in Homonhon, or sighting at least this part of the Philippine archipelago, was to be become in stark contrast, right? To the very bad experience, and now suddenly, like you said, they're about to find relief. So what the first island which they sighted was this Giwan, or was this Homonhon right away, or Suluan?
They anchored off Suluan in the afternoon of March 16. They did not land because they're still smarting from what happened in Ladrones. The next day morning, they saw 2 bangka rounding off the north of Suluan. When they tried to give a chase, these bangkas turned around and
returned
away to the east of northeast of Suluan. So they decided to land in another island that was not populated. So they were trying to locate an island na Waraitao. And so they landed in Homonhon. And so it was March 17. And so the islands that they saw, they basically commemorated it by naming them the archipelago of San Lazaro.
One of the most detailed accounts about this event and the subsequent events of their arrival in the Visayas specifically is that by Antonio Pigafetta, right?
It's basically the main reference for the Magellan expedition.
Yeah.
It's the most authoritative, considered the most authoritative is the Pigafetta account.
You mentioned that the Quincentennial Commemorations theme is humanity. Was it
Humanity and victory.
humanity and victory?
It's basically to humanity in Homonhon and
Mm.
victory in Mactan.
And these themes are very significant, right? They're more than just words. Like you talked about, there was an issue about the word discovery,
Yes,
and
yes.
rediscovery was an alternative proposed, and
Now it's just citing.
citing. So, and there's even the more neutral way to call it, which is encounter. That's how the Quincentennial Commemorations, in a way, figures
Yes.
the event, right? So it's an encounter between Spain and what would later be named the Philippines.
Encounter between East and West.
East and West, yeah. Why do you think it was problematic, for example, to call it discovery? This is a very familiar
Because
issue.
there's already some belief that some Europeans had been here
Yep,
before
Magellan.
before Magellan arrived, and in fact there is still some belief that actually when he was still with Portugal, Magellan had actually reached these islands. And so when they say Magellan was the first circumnavigator of the world, it can be argued logically, even if he died in Mactan, it could be argued logically because it seems that his cousin and friend Francisco Serrano, he had actually reached the Moluccas, which is actually along the same longitude.
But even if someone was able to circumnavigate or arrive in the Philippines before Magellan did, the idea of discovery would still be problematic, right? Because it's coming from the point of view of
Europe,
an outsider. But in our perspective, it wasn't really that, because discover is an active verb, and it subjects the direct. These are technical terms, but like it would subject us to
certain passivity
Yeah.
on that
in that
discovery.
phrasing, right? So it was something that was done to us, and we were like just passive people who were, being discovered, so to speak. So this is very interesting because I've also been invested in understanding how the writing of history works. So a more critical look at the task of historiography, right? So that, because often probably some people might think that history is purely objective, it's empirical, it's a recording of events in
As
the
they
most
happen.
scientific way, as they happen. Of course, history has to have that orientation, right?
Yes.
It has to value accuracy and objectivity, but it is also inevitable that the historian figures past events in particular ways.
Yes,
So there's
it has been said that you cannot actually write a history of events until they are 50 years old or something like that, because before it becomes 50 years old, wala pang perspective. There's an event, you cannot place a proper perspective for it yet until it becomes 50 years old or 100 years old.
You're still in the thick of events, and you don't have that enough distance to at least look at it from a more holistic point of view. And like I said, I'm interested in the poetics of history and in the writing of it. And I recall the American historian Hayden White, who spoke about tropology. And according to him, this is about how this is a theory of figuration and what he calls the discursive implotment of particular events from the past. That in a way, the past events are written about poetically. So it's not just an objective recording of past events, and that's why words like discovery and encounter become
value laden.
value laden, and it's a point of what do you call this, debate. It becomes a point of debate because we are becoming more critical to the point of view and to how, you know, particular characters in the history are figured and then presented. So history is, we can say history is discursive, ano, na bagat how words and the choice of words are underpinned by power to shape particular perspectives and construct reality. So now that the idea of encounter is becoming more and more familiar because of the Quincentennial Commemorations, and they even make it clear that they're not celebrating the colonization of the Philippines. Diba? Parang the way they phrase it is...
Yes. Wala. No colonial aspect yet.
Yeah.
It's basically first encounter.
Uh-huh. And sometimes I think it's even, rather than just neutral, it tries to look at it from the side of the Filipinos, when particularly
Both the
when
natives
and the
newcomers.
particularly when it articulates that what is being commemorated or celebrated is the Philippine part
Yes.
of the
Philippine
first.
part of the circumnavigation of the world.
So you earlier you mentioned the word magnanimity or humanity,
Humanity.
especially as associated with the first encounter in Homonhon.
It actually started with, because the original slogan was valor and victory. And then maybe we should parang lapu-lapu na lang ito. We should put then magnanimity, and then that magnanimity gave way to humanity. So humanity, the final now is humanity and victory.
It's more inclusive, no? It's not just about warfare anymore. It's not just about that, you know, victory.
It's now being human.
Which is also another important value being celebrated. So I read an excerpt from the account by Pigafetta, and especially how he wrote about that first encounter in Homonhon. So how do you from what you recall in Pigafetta's account, how it was magnanimity portrayed?
Well, actually, I was asked to. I had already been asked to lecture several facets of Homonhon, including the food that Magellan possibly ate in the Visayas. But we have to look into that aspect. Pigafetta actually, 1/3 of his Homonhon narrative is about the coconut, and that was the first most detailed description of the coconut for the Western world. The first thing he mentioned was how to tap tuba, how to tap the coconut wine. And so in the paper, in the lecture on the thing that Magellan possibly ate, because Pigafetta made it look like they were the ones who fed the Filipino guests first, but it's not Filipino. So given that he gave importance to the coconut, it seems that after the people from Suluan came, there was already order to get coconuts
and to offer them to the crew.
Parang we still have to do that now. You go to the rural area, you are brought to the coconut plantation, panlamaw. So then only later would you be talking business or sense after you have taken your coconut water and coconut meat. And Magellan, actually for the sick members, he always came in the morning and gave the coconut water to the sick crew members from his own hands. And so I believe that after the first encounter, given Filipino hospitality, they left some 2 or 3 people behind to pick the coconuts every day and to get the tuba every day for the crew members. Because they were not only resting, they were also bathing in the river or in the sea, and also drinking to
Yeah.
That's they had a happy time, very happy time in Homonhon.
And that's even that would even seem happier when we consider that they have come from a very bad
Yes,
experience
yes.
of traveling, right? So, okay, I'm starting to imagine because, of course, you know, in that first encounter, these two groups, of course, spoke different languages.
Yeah.
So they were,
Well,
in a way,
there's always the thing about because even Pigafetta thought that Enrique de Malacca could not speak very well with the natives. But my analysis of
Enrique de Malacca,
the details
he's a
the slave of
translator,
Magellan,
supposedly.
was hired as translator.
He's not. It's like contested whether he's Filipino or not, right?
There are people who claim that he was Filipino, but at least he knew how to speak
the language of the natives,
the Malay language.
Yeah.
And the details about the translation, Pigafetta's details about the coconut is so detailed that when he asked the question to Enrique and Enrique asked the native, the answer fits very well, such that the information about the coconut was very technically detailed. So I believe that Enrique de Malacca knew more about the language than he was given credit for. But I would not say he was Filipino. He knew the language.
That's also interesting from the perspective that, you know, although there was a translator, they did not speak the same language, and in a way, food was part of how they communicated.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
Because,
in terms of gesture, in terms of hospitality, what they can offer. So, the first encounter really, according to these accounts and how they are rendered in retellings, that first encounter is figured as an event where the natives demonstrate their humanity to strangers.
I actually enhanced already. I already enhanced that in the narrative because Pigafetta said that the first meeting on Monday, all of them, everybody just went away, went home to Suluan, and came back 4 or 5 days later. But that's not very Filipino. You have guests, so you have to so you have to really to leave people behind to attend to the needs of the guests.
Yeah.
And probably this the 2 or 3 people who were left behind would guide them to the forest to get beeswax for that. Kasi wala na silang for their lamps and for their candles, because the name Homonhon is actually Umo, full of beeswax. Umo is the dried, the hive, beehive na wala ng bees. Umo. So you say Homonhon,
full of that.
So they were able to get that from the forest, of course with the help of the natives, and then at the same time there are still hives with honeybees, and then it would have been the natives who would drive out the bees to get both the hive and the honey, which was given to the sick members. And it helped them because although at that time hindi pa nila alam yung vitamin C, but honey is a good cure for scurvy.
Which they suffered when they suffered. Like those terms also, like because in my own experience of reading these accounts and reading about those events from the 1500s and even in the 1600s, the early period of Spanish colonization of the Philippines, I'm drawn to words and how, for example, local terms seem to be corrupted by Spanish chroniclers and the possible meanings underpin, or like how words transform and their significations transform in this act of naming. And we have that in place names as well, like
Place names.
toponyms, for example. I've read that Giwan comes from the local term Giwanun,
Guiana is basically the water is salty.
salty. Yeah. Zamal or Samar,
Samar is actually wound.
like Samar. That's one speculation, or it's a
Well, sometime during the 16th century, 1600s, suddenly the R became D in Visayan language. Samar, Samar, and then
the R became the.
there was a linguistic shift,
Uh-huh.
which I associated with the impact of the Sonoray Rebellion.
When was this? Probably like around what
About
century?
1649. 1649. The Sonoray Rebellion was 1649, 1650. So the shift between R and D, as I had studied in the Sanchez Dictionary, happened around that time. Because Father Alcina was caught in between. Some of these words are pa, and then the others are already D.
Well, Sumuroy and Sumudoy are examples of this shift.
Sumuroy.
Yeah.
And then Sumudoy.
And there's also other words like, I think Parayaw, for example, comes from Dayaw, right?
The root word is dial.
So when you wanna,
When
you're
say somebody,
like someone who nga na Parayaw is someone who seeks for Dayaw,
Dayaw.
for praise, right?
not padayaw.
Yeah, not Padayaw. So I like that idea about Samar as etymologically possibly traced to the word samad. It's also interesting because I've read from somewhere that when these Spanish chroniclers or colonizers were observing the archipelago, they were also very specific with how they described the geography, the topography, and I remember that some of these Spaniards noted Samar Island as having many crevices.
It was actually a Spanish governor of Samar who explained that it has a wounded landscape. It's crisscrossed by rivers.
And Leyte, on the other hand, well, to what word is it traced?
This goes back to this was Buyo. The first word in the Villalobos expedition was Buyo. We know what Buyo is, it's mama, things like that.
Villalobos was in what year?
1543. And then the next words, it has now become Aboyo. And so nawala na yung sense sa Aboyo. And then later, Aboyog. Because what happened there is they put something, yung maragsa, buyo. So they put a Q, something to indicate, the Spaniards to indicate that it is a maragsa. But we, local native readers, will also read that.
It is a maragsa. What did you mean by that? Like, it's
accent.
Buyo.
Accent.
How do you say it? Buyo.
Buyo.
So it's like a glottal stop. Like the O is glottal.
Glottal stop.
But
the Spaniards would indicate that with a Q.
Yeah. Okay.
And then later, the native readers will read that as G. And so, Aboyog. And then, it's now become Aboyog.
Yeah. And
so the original meaning of the word had been totally corrupted.
So, Abuyog, the toponym of Abuyog, has nothing to do with these.
It really, the first word was Boyo.
Yeah.
And
which is the betel nut.
The betel nut.
Yeah.
Which counterpart was bunga.
Right.
Palm.
And there are other place names as well, right? Because like Ibabaw and Tandaya. Is it still debated whether Ibabaw or Tandaya is Leyte or Samar?
Well, it's already clear that Ibabaw is northeastern Samar. Northeastern Samar.
Northeastern. So not the whole of Samar.
Not the whole of Samar, just the north and eastern part.
Yeah.
Ibabaw. Because at that time, actually, so, southern Leyte, there's Silani. But in Chaujukwa, it was not actually Silani, it is Silong. Downstairs. Then Ibabaw, then people in this region at the time already knew which was at the top and which was at the bottom. Because by the time Magellan came, they drew their maps with the south at the top and the north at the bottom.
That's how Magellan. That's how their
the time of
cartography
Magellan.
worked.
The Westerners drew their maps with south at the top and north at the bottom. But in our the
Pre-Hispanic.
natives, in our pre-Hispanic natives, in our region, they already knew which was top and which was bottom. Ibabaw and Silong.
Yeah. That's very interesting because, I mean, Ibabaw and Silong could also be from the point of view of you standing on ground. So it's Ibabaw would be sky and Silong would be earth, right? But like in this case, it's a more cartographic sense of direction. So Tandaya, on the other hand, is associated with Leyte?
No, it's basically southern Samar. Kandaya. Daya is actually a flat bottom boat. So when we went to Butuan, actually, they found this mother of all balangas. But actually, I told the head archaeologist that maybe it's Daya. That boat is Daya, not Balangay. Because around the time of the Villalobos expedition, the Portuguese governor of Moluccas actually wrote a report and said that there are boats somewhere here in this area, Tandaya, that can sail to China in 1 week's time. Flat bottom boat, about 4 meters wide and about 20 meters long. Flat bottom. Because at the time they called and it is in the dictionary, Santos Dictionary, Daya as a boat.
I'm also interested in how, in the act of, and naming is a very political act, right? Because, when the Spaniards gave names to particular places in the archipelago, it was a symbolic act of territorializing, so to speak.
Well, it's really, when you see a place, then you document and then you put a name, because later, if you for legalities, you are the discoverer of the place and you own that place.
And the act of naming is the basis for
that.
For that. And but what I find amusing as well is, in some cases when the Spaniards were encountering places in, let's say, in Eastern Visayas, they thought that, let's say, Giwan was an island, but they were not realizing that it was just the tip of a larger island that was Samar, or that Abuyo was it? Am I recalling it right? Like they also thought
it
that
was not yet Abuyo.
Abuyo was an island
at the time, because what would represent Leyte at the time was Abarien, which is actually Kabalian. Abarien.
This is in the eastern coast of Leyte.
Yes. Southeastern, and Yunangan, which is basically Hinonangan. So this represents Leyte in the archipelago of San Lazaro. And Samal is of course Samar. And Homonhon. Again, that's the thing there, because Pigafetta wrote a lot of H's, and we read the H's.
Yeah, but in Spanish it's silent.
In fact, in Italian and in Spanish, you are not supposed to read the H's. But we read it, and so
Now, Well, when we talk about the Quincentennial Commemorations, it's a nationwide endeavor in the Philippines, and many parts of the country have their activities. For example, like in Cebu,
Yes,
a lot of activities are centered on Cebu, but
they will commemorate first baptism in Cebu, but it's a church activity,
in April.
and the government is taking hands on.
So in our part of the country, in Eastern Visayas,
We have basically two. One is government, the other is church.
Mhm.
Humanity in Homonhon,
Yep.
and
So we have both. Best of both worlds in this case. To me, there seems to be for example, when contemporary scholars talk about history, some local scholars would point out that Leyte was actually the first Filipinas,
Let's start with Archipelago de San Lazaro. Samar and Leyte were already included in that.
Mhm.
And then Villalobos came because they got a good reception here, and they got food. They were given food for the attempted return trip. They could always find food here, and so they named basically Tandaya, Aboyo, and Masao as the original Las Islas Filipinas. The first just the three islands.
And I see this also in other texts, that there's this celebration of that as like being the first place or like group of places to be named Filipinas. Like, for example, Agustin El Omora has a drama entitled Leyte, Isle of First,
Islands are first.
Leyte Isla, or Porohan Kasyahanan. And like that idea of the first Filipinas is part of this drama. So finally, we'd like to ask you, why do you think it's important to talk about history in general, and more specifically to be informed about the series of events which the Quincentennial Commemorations are celebrating?
Well, it is important to learn about our history because it's where we started. At least somebody said ang hindi lumingon sa pinanggalingan ay hindi makakarating sa paroroonan. So it's very necessary to look back, so that we can have a good footage in bringing ourselves to the future. And insofar as the history of Samar and Leyte is concerned, the digitization, the age of digitization of documents brought up the fact that actually there is simply much document about our early historical experience that can be studied and written about. And by doing so, it can make us more proud of ourselves and our own historical experience, our cultural beginnings, and things like that. It's always advantageous to be rooted in our history and culture.
Damo nga salamat, Dr. Rolando Borrinaga. This has been a very wonderful afternoon, and I'm looking forward to have another conversation with you. It's always a pleasure to speak with you about local history.
Damo na liwat nga salamat, Mar, sa pag-imbita rin ng programa.